There we go. I'll get rid of me. That's going to give me.
Hello everybody. Good morning, New York, and to the rest of the world. Good afternoon in Europe, and good evening in Asia. Welcome to the third and final session of the IIP webinar series on promoting gender equality in education. My name is Miyoko Saito. I'm coordinating the course, which is actually driving organizing this series of webinar about 2 weeks ago, since 2 weeks ago. Now, 2 weeks ago, we had Aaron Benabot from Global Education Monitoring Report to present something about the gender review of the Global Education Monitoring Report. Last week, we had Karen Mundy from GPE to hear about the new funding mechanism and their gender equality policy. Now, we're going to have today Nora Fyles from UNGEI to hear about the UNGEI-GPE Guidance on the preparation of, I think I got the title right, the Education Sector Plan. Now, Nora is going to correct me later if I did not get the title right. Now, let me introduce Nora. Nora is the head of the UNGEI. Everybody knows what UNGEI means. That's the United Nations Girls Education Initiative Secretariat. Before taking the post as the head of UNGEI, Nora was actually leading the education program within the Canadian International Development Agency, CEDA. And Nora also has a lot of experience working on gender-related programs and projects in many countries of Asia. So let me introduce Nora at this time, okay? There you go.
There we go. Thank you very much, Miyoko. It's a pleasure to participate in the webinar today. And thank you also for referencing the two webinars that came last week and the previous 2 weeks, because they place such an important role in terms of providing background for this conversation today.
Okay, great. Are you ready to present your PowerPoint presentation, or would you like us to just talk or?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll just correct you a tiny bit. I'm afraid to say I cannot claim responsibility for CEDA's education program, but I was leading the policy team in education for CEDA, so I provided that kind of oversight for policy, but not for the entire program. Okay, I think we're ready to go with the PowerPoint presentation. Can you have them confirm that? Miyoko, can you see the presentation?
Yes, please go ahead, Nora. Yes.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, now, before I introduce the guidance, I would like to, and you can see the title is the UNGEI-GPE Guidance on Gender Responsive Education Sector Plans. It's called a guidance and not a tool because it really is an orientation rather than a step-by-step approach. But before, I'm just going to change the PowerPoint here. Before we turn to the guidance, I would just like to say a few words on UNGEI. You said everybody knows UNGEI, but perhaps not everybody does understand what that is, what's it all about. So just a few words. UNGEI is not a funding body, and we don't carry out programs, but our members do. We are a multi-stakeholder partnership, which was launched in 2000, so we are now a 16-year-old partnership, one of the oldest around, and the oldest one certainly, which addresses gender equality and girls' education. We were launched to champion those issues, the gender and education goals, and we are committed to improving the quality and availability of girls' education and to achieving gender equality. We work at the global, regional, and country level. We have a community of practice and an executive body that works at the global level, which includes 27 member organizations, the key member organizations engaged in girls' education and gender working around the world. We have 4 regional networks and upwards of 50 affiliated country-based partnerships, coalitions, and networks from around the world. UNICEF is the lead agency for UNGEI and hosts the Secretariat in New York, as well as the focal points in 4 UNICEF regional offices. Now, we're very proud of the statement which the GMR report identified last year for us and acknowledged that UNGEI was the most visible global initiative associated with gender equality and EFA, Education for All. Now, just a few words about UNGEI's approach. Now, just to say that UNGEI is currently going through a process of strategic review. So this is in the midst of shifting, but let me share with you the current priorities. UNGEI works largely through policy advocacy to ensure that national and global policy frameworks promote girls' education and gender equality. We promote evidence building on girls' education and gender issues and the sharing of experience. For example, we fund and we technically support the GEM Gender Review and have done so for some years. We host the UNGEI Good Practice Fund, and the case studies and synthesis and evidence review were launched last week at ODI in London. You may be interested to have a quick look at the UNGEI website to find the 17 case studies. We also encourage collaboration and partnership at the country, regional, and global level. Our advocacy and evidence-building efforts focus on 4 areas, which are listed here. Enhanced focus on marginalized and excluded groups, the elimination of school-related gender-based violence, the improvement of learning outcomes for girls, and increased transition to secondary and other post-primary opportunities. Since the outset of UNGEI's work, we have recognized and been committed to working with national education systems. This is because it is there that gender equality and girls' education is owned, is managed, is sustained, and will go on long after UNGEI goes on to do something else. So for that reason, EFA FTI, which is now the GPE, has been an important partner for UNGEI since the FTI was launched in 2002. UNGEI was the FTI Gender Task Team, which started when they established task teams early after their launch in 2002. UNGEI carried out the first gender review of the first 12 FTI-endorsed education sector plans. This was a very unusual and bit of a groundbreaking piece of work, which I have to say has not been done again. Although last week you heard Karen Mundy reference a stock taking of 42 education sector plans in regard to gender. So it's building on that same early work that we did. In 2012, UNGEI formalized our working relationship with the GPE, and so that we could better support the implementation of their first strategic plan. We chaired a thematic working group on girls' education. We launched the work around the gender analysis tool, which is now called the Guidance. We worked with the IIP to do a gender review of their guidance on education sector planning and appraisal, it was called at that time. We also supported stock taking that was referenced just now, and we collaborated with Plan International on a gender review in Lao PDR using a very early version of the guidance. Now let's turn to the guidance. The idea behind the guidance is in all countries, in all countries, questions of gender need to be considered systematically to ensure that plans and strategies address the needs of girls and boys, and also structural barriers based on gender discrimination. Education sector plans should be gender responsive, and the guidelines integrate questions and guidance to support local education groups and ministries to prepare and appraise plans that keep this in mind. So what was the process? How did we do this? We built on existing frameworks and tools, although that was a stretch because there were very few pieces to draw from, very little work. in this area of bringing together education and gender in the planning process. We began by convening country-level workshops so we could pilot our approach. We worked in Malawi, in Guinea, in Eritrea, ensuring that we were in 3 very different country contexts, although all 3 of them took place in Africa. We're quite conscious of that, and we are alert to the fact that we need to become better experienced in other regions of the world as well. We brought together gender theory analysis and gender mainstreaming in government systems, together with the economic analysis, education economics, and these 2 have not interacted very often. So this has been a challenge to bring together the gender theory analysis and gender mainstreaming with economic analysis, planning, and monitoring approaches. The guidance is grounded on the IIEP framework for credible sector plan and process. It takes a capacity development approach to build independence and sustainability at the country level. And it includes as many country examples as we could, recognizing that all plans and policies are grounded in the context in which they will be implemented, and also so we could learn from the experience of others. So what is the guidance? It's intended to be a practical tool to assist planners and practitioners in addressing gender issues in education sector planning and plans themselves. Ideally, the guidance should be paired with a workshop or other facilitated exercise that encourages dialogue and discussion among stakeholders, although anyone can pick it up and find components which might be useful at different times. Now, we identified that the sector analysis and sector planning process is a very opportune time to use the guidance, because it is then that the country will be reflecting on their experience, doing the analysis as part of the education sector process. But other times of review, monitoring, and reporting are also opportunities. Actually, the work we did in Lao PDR, that Plan did in Lao PDR with our support and with others, under the leadership of the government, of course, took place in the context of a midterm review. It was not a planning time, it was a review time. But they have drawn on that work and used it for their planning process, which came along much later, 2 years in fact. Now, why do we consider it important? Now, it builds on existing technical tools. I've mentioned that before, but I wanted to repeat that because it is so central to our thesis, and everyone needs to understand this is not a standalone, separate process we are advocating for, but rather we recommend that people draw on the work of UNICEF, GPE, and the World Bank, the methodological guidelines, which there are 2 volumes now and a 3rd is being developed, and the tools provided by IIP, and use those in context, in collaboration with this guidance. But what this approach does is puts a spotlight on gender issues in the specific country context. So it makes the process richer and ensures that things do not get left behind, and we are not surprised when we're implementing the sector plan down the road that certain components were lost, were left out. Now, the target audience you can see here on this slide is very broad, but if we slip down, it includes, international donors and actors, country-level actors, Ministry of Education officials, other ministry officials. We're looking also very much at a combination of education planners and gender experts, the gender focal point, the gender advisory group, the gender unit within the Ministry of Education, in conversation with the Ministry of Education Planning Unit. Those are the 2 core audience members of the audience whom we really hope to engage with around this guidance. But we know that with the GPE's work now broadening to bring in cross-sectoral actors, and we know that the Ministry of Education officials are often reaching out to other ministries, Ministry of Health, of Youth and Sport, of Gender Equality. So it's those other ministries also who may be interested in this guidance, because it does follow the education sector planning process, which is not well understood outside of the Ministry of Education. This is a very central slide for understanding the rationale of the guidance. We understand that gender-responsive sector planning is informed by gender analysis. It means looking at the taking gender into consideration as you look at the whole education sector and the context in which it sits, though in fact the development, the context of the country. It includes and is informed by a participatory stakeholder consultation. That's part of the IIP recommended process for a credible plan that includes a stakeholder consultation. But that's also the foundation of gender analysis, that whatever is done includes voices from men and women, as well as youth and children, both girls and boys. It promotes gender mainstreaming. That means looking at integrating gender across all the process, asking questions of gender in all that is done, as well as a targeted approach. So we call it, what do we call it? Two-pronged approach in the guidance. You may have seen that if you've had a look at it. It applies a gender lens to all. That means it's not looking simply at girls' education, but rather where girls or boys are excluded or are disengaged, are pulled out or pushed out of school. So it is a gendered approach, not a girls' education approach, which we advocate. To go back to the slide, the gender-responsive sector planning is supported by financial resources, institutional capacity, and political will. We know that on occasion, there are some extremely sound strategies developed, but if they're not funded, if they're not adequately resourced, they will not lead to sector planning, which is actually gender responsive. They will not be picked up and integrated through the process. And we know also, and the part of the guidance highlights the importance of institutional capacity. The country has the know-how, the skills to introduce and to do the sector planning and then to implement the sector plan. And of course, political will is critical in this area, where on occasion, we need champions and we need courage to step up where this may not be recognized as critically important. So it's facilitated by expertise, by knowledge sharing, and strengthened through gender-sensitive monitoring and evaluation. I want to say just a couple of more things which are not on the slide, but which are really critical to understanding our rationale as well. That gender-responsive education sector planning reinforces the need to examine inequalities across regions, across wealth quintiles, languages, and abilities, as all of these areas of separation and marginalization intersect with gender, so that we can identify which girls and which boys are excluded, not getting into school. We know, in fact, that the poorest rural girls, the girls in conflict and fragile environments, and girls with disability are least likely to be in school. And we know that boys in low and middle income countries, boys in Asia are most likely to disengage, are most likely to underperform and to drop out of school. So this gender-responsive approach requires that we really do a deep dive into understanding which girls and which boys, and not assume that this is all girls who are excluded from school, because we know that is not the case. Okay, I'm giving you here an outline of the guidance. For those of you who are in the course, you may have seen the conference version. The paper is now in print, and so it's being formatted so that you might be able to see this more clearly in the new version of the guidance. But just as to highlight that the guidance intends to take you through a process which would be familiar in education sector planning, starting with the analysis, therefore looking at the enabling environment, the larger environment or the political economy in which education sits, looking very specifically at education sector policy, moving to an analysis of data, looking at how a gender parity index fits within our understanding of gender equality more broadly, the opportunities and the limitations of the tools we have at our fingertips currently, the type of data we collect and what that tells us or fails to tell us about gender equality in education. It also moves us through an analysis of the institutional capacity of the Ministry of Education to address gender equality. It then looks a little bit more broadly at what would it look like to have a gender-sensitive stakeholder consultation. This is moving into the planning cycle, looking at a variety of strategies and interventions, and the challenges of having to make a decision based on evidence and other criteria of which strategies are most appropriate in which context. Looking at costing and financing, which is a very economic way of analyzing what are the policy choices and trade-offs which we must make in order to program appropriately in the context. And our effort in this module is to integrate gender considerations in that process, which usually doesn't include that, influencing these assumptions. So we assume that that the outcomes will be gendered outcomes as well as learning outcomes without a gender consideration. And then module 9 looks at monitoring and evaluation to support gender equality. The final module offers us a summary checklist, very much in line with the IIP appraisal. The tool is called Guidance on Appraisal. Sorry, I'm forgetting the name. But it is similar to that process, asking again, to what extent is the education sector plan gender responsive, so it comes to the end and can be brought in after the plan has been developed. I thought you might like to see the type of questions which we introduce as a core component of the guidance. Every module introduces at first the theory, some of the gendered analysis examples from theory, but also as many examples as we could locate from different countries to make it as robust as possible and to recognize the various ways in which different countries have addressed the particular theme. And then each module quickly turns to an approach which introduces questions. This is taken from the module on institutional capacity and asks questions of capacity at the individual level, about knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary to integrate gender considerations across the education sector, asks about the percentage of a training budget allocated to building capacity related to gender. It also asks questions of reflection for those who are using the guidance about whether or not there is a unit or focal point responsible for gender equality, and more details about that. Is there a budget associated? Who is accountable for this focal point? And what other resources and expertise are allocated to the unit? This would help the reader of the guidance or the group who's working with the guidance to reflect on their own experience, and allows for those who are participating to come with recommended actions at the end of each module, suggesting how they might do things differently if necessary, or to strengthen what they have already. I wanted to just raise a couple of the elements which are actually touched on in this particular module on capacity. That the fact that there is a variety of types of expertise related to gender, which might be relevant and important for the country to integrate gender equality into its sector planning in a robust way. Types of expertise such as a champion, someone who does not need to be hands-on in this area, but who can demonstrate commitment on the part of the ministry. A gender focal point, to convene and gather gender expertise, to oversee and coordinate gender mainstreaming. And then an expert, a researcher, a policy or data analyst, a planner or evaluator with special expertise in gender equality to make sure that the content is rich and influenced by knowledge and experience. Gender equality is not always recognized as an area of expertise on its own within a Ministry of Education, but it's as expert, one might say, as those who are expert in curriculum design, in the development of textbooks, and in monitoring and evaluation. I was interested to read on the discussion board on the dialogue chat function. I don't have that the right language, sorry, which is part of your course. And there was some question about mainstreaming gender equality in ministries of education and how effective or how challenging that has been. And I was interested to read the input from an Ethiopian colleague who spoke about the very strong unit which is being put in place within the gender directorate of the the establishment of a gender directorate at the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Education, a gender unit in regional education bureaus and higher learning institutions, and some education offices at the regional or at the Warada level. Now, these are all put in place to help with the implementation of the gender equality strategy, which the Ethiopian Ministry of Education has launched recently. But the writer also raised the challenges of, even if there is this scaffolding, which is so strong in Ethiopia, actually providing it with the type of individuals who have the expertise to manage this structure and the resources to feed it, to make sure that there is, for example, just the ability to get around in various regions and to follow on the implementation of this strategy right down to the school level. So recognizing that even when ministries have all the best intentions and actually go through the process of establishing the strong institutional structure, making sure that that works effectively takes a lot more energy and attention. So I was really interested in that contribution by your Ethiopian colleague, and I agree that there are some both challenges and opportunities put forward within this structure, fairly complicated one. Now, we have offered this, one of the last slides I'm going to share, because it demonstrates the intention of the guidance to synthesize with one module leading on to the next. So in this slide, you can see that there is the module 2 introduces the enabling environment. Module 3 applies a gender lens to the education sector policy, which leads on to module 4, looking at the data. What is actually the experience, the quantitative information we have at hand, the qualitative information we have on hand to really understand the dynamics in the education sector and the experience of boys and girls. And then looking at the institutional capacity, and all this work, all this analysis come together in the module on selecting strategies and interventions. Because it's only with all this other work behind you that you will be able to do a good job at selecting strategies and interventions which are most appropriate in the context in which they will be implemented. Looking at the larger budget issues and the institutional structure in which the strategies will be managed, will be introduced, will be implemented. All of this other work needs to come before in order to come to the position of selecting strategies. So the guidance intentionally seeks to find areas to promote synthesis, analysis, and for the reader and the participant in the whatever process of using the guidance to come to more and more decision-making opportunities that will allow them to feed into the sector planning process and to come with a plan which is sound and appropriate. Now, I'm going to stop there. Many of you have the conference version already. I would just like to briefly stop on this last slide to look at the next steps. The first thing is to say, as I mentioned before, the guidance itself is in the draft form in terms of it's finished, but it hasn't been formally published. It is now with GPE, who is formatting and moving to translation and publication of the document so that it will be readily available on the UNGEI website, on the GPE website, and on others as well. Probably IIP will want to make that available for others to use on a regular basis. And I would encourage you, if you do have a conference version, to, when this is ready, to discard the conference version so we don't have lots of different versions wandering around out there. We're soon, however, moving from the guidance itself to sharing it through a workshop process, bringing together groups of countries who are in the process of review or renewal of their sector plans or in sector planning process. GPE, Plan International, and Dubai Cares are working together with UNGEI on the first regional workshop, which is scheduled to take place in Eastern Africa sometime in the new year, probably around March, but the date has not been identified as yet. We hope to host 2 other regional workshops soon after that in West Africa and then further in Asia. Not sure whether the Asian work will happen in 2017 or, depending on our work plan, whether that will be bumped to the next year. We are doing outreach to countries to see who is in the best position to engage in this process, recognizing that countries have a lot of other things on their plates and have much to handle, recognizing also the ongoing challenge of crisis, of governance shocks, of refugee situations which interfere with this long-term development planning process. And we do need to see how these two interact with each other, and don't for 1 minute consider that this is going to be a priority in all situations. We also are committed to continued collaboration with IIP, UNICEF, and other partners to build a library of resources and tools on gender responsive sector planning. And we really appreciate the work that Miyoko and her team has done to collect up more and more materials. The UNGEI Secretariat is very small, and although we're really committed to this work, we really appreciate the extreme expertise that is provided by IIP in the area of sector planning. And now the new approach of integrating gender equality into this work allows you to have access to a much broader library of resources, which we'll all draw on. Now, I'm going to stop with the slides here, and we're going to come back, try and close them down. Sorry for there we go. I think that's done it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Nora. First of all, I'd like to actually thank UNGEI for making this conference version available for the course, because that has been the backbone, so to speak, the backbone for this course. We have been always referring to all of the steps and all the other materials and the knowledge that were cited in these documents. So it's been very helpful. All right. Now, with that said, you still haven't told us when the new version is going to be published. Is that?
I'll answer that very quickly to say I'm afraid I don't have an answer, because it's not with us. It's with GPE, and they are working with a designer to format it. We have the experience of the Good Practice Fund and the extreme challenge of finalizing documents. You have that experience as well. So it's with a designer for publication. They already have translated the version, the conference version, so that will come quite quickly. It will, in the first instance, be available in French and English. I don't know whether there will be other versions in the future, other languages, but we know that that will come quite soon. As soon as soon as it's ready for publication, it will go straight to 2 languages.
Great. All right. Now, I want to start with this question that is about this new gender requirements, that are imposed within the SDGs. What are the kinds of challenges and the opportunities for the countries who might have already done the ESP before, and some other countries who have not yet done any, the preparation of the ESP before? So what could be the challenges and opportunities for them?
Yeah, that's an extremely important question, and I think that many people are asking that question just because it is the SDG agenda is much more conscious and reflective of gender equality. However, that is not to say that the MDGs and EFA goals did not have a focus on that as well. What is different is the expectation that the monitoring of goals will also integrate these gender expectations, that we will understand better what is the experience of girls and boys, and also a larger understanding that gender parity is insufficient. It doesn't tell us enough about what goes on in the classroom and about how girls and boys will experience education through the access to the experience in the classroom and the experience of opportunities through school into the workforce or other livelihoods. So the understanding that we need to monitor, we are able to monitor with indicators, both thematic indicators and the core indicators, the changes in gender equality, such as the indicator 4.7, which raises an expectation that countries will be able to report on how well they mainstream gender equality in planning, in learning environments, in teacher training and assessment. That is a whole different expectation which we never had before. So that will require countries to actually document, to do this analysis and say, okay, how well are we taking gender into consideration in our policies, in our teacher training, and in the assessments we do of learning. And the environment of learning. That's a very tall order. There is also a new expectation, if I can go on a wee little bit longer, about we're newly recognizing that there is gender violence in the school, around the school. This was never recognized before. Our line has always been to bring children to school, girls and boys, to ensure all girls and all boys are in school and are staying in school through adolescence. Now, what we know, though, through experience of the last 15 years, is that we may be dealing with an ethical question here of, while we're asking girls and boys to stay and remain in school, it is also a situation where there is violence, gender-based violence included. So we now have a new understanding that we need to monitor that. How safe is this learning environment? How gender responsive is the learning environment? And that means actually going back to the process of creating indicators, which is, going back to first principles, not only raising the expectation we need to monitor this, but also we have to create indicators and a way of collecting this information. Now, the global community is taking the lead on that and not expecting every country to develop its own monitoring system. However, it is requiring new relationships across sectors. The child protection community, as well as the gender and education community, are needing to talk together in a different way in order to develop indicators which really do recognize the fragility of the school system and the fact that it is a mirror of society. And therefore, if there's gender violence in society, it is going to be in the school system as well.
Right. So that means that we have to have a lot of collaboration, well, of course, across sectors, but then some of the research agenda, it used to be research agenda, but that become the planning agenda, because we are now required to produce a lot of different kinds of indicators, right?
That's
so,
right.
Yeah, now I have some questions that have just come in. So I hope you're ready for that.
I can't promise to be ready for your questions, but I'm really pleased to have a conversation. So let's see what we get.
Okay, here we go. How would you suggest NGOs to collaborate with the central government in gender-related education planning, considering the outside role in policy level decisions? So the role of NGOs.
Can I answer that one? Can I reflect on that one? That is a really important question. And actually, it's so important that there was entire, I don't want to say it was entirely around this, but the high-level meeting on aid effectiveness that took place in Accra was focusing on civil society actors as key players in government systems, in influencing and providing the accountability mechanism for governments to ensure that their work reflects the reality of their people. The best way, and the way which GPE is really committed as well, and I would think Karen would have answered this question the same way, is to reinforce the role of civil society as members of the local education group, where the work of planning and policy development and implementation is discussed on a regular basis under the leadership of the Ministry of Education with the other donors and actors. So for civil society to engage effectively on the local education group is the best mechanism. We also know that the Global Campaign for Education and its enormous network of national coalitions is extremely important. The national coalitions bring together all of the civil society actors in education at the country level, and they speak on behalf of the NGO community, so that they can speak with one voice and can advocate effectively at the country level, and through the regional networks to that body, for example, ANSEFA and ASPE, both of whom are represented on UNGEI's Global Advisory Committee as advisors to the partnership, but also through the network to the Global Campaign for Education, so that the civil society can speak with one voice globally, regionally, and at the country level.
Yeah, the NGOs are very important allies and the advocates actually. The guidance mentions bias-free teaching and learning materials and pedagogy as a promising intervention. Do you have any examples of countries where these interventions have been implemented? That's the next question. Yeah, go ahead.
I think I'm going to repeat it because you weren't perfectly clear, but it's about teacher training, teacher training materials,
right. Yeah,
and pedagogical approaches. Is that right?
That's right.
This is an area, and actually the whole area of teacher training is one where there's lots of room for improvement. I hate to say, they put their finger on a really important area where we're hoping more and more work will go in the coming years. It's really actually a critically important place, particularly at the, may I say, at the primary level, because it is primary level teachers who first meet children who will have expectations for how girls will perform, for example, in STEM subjects, or boys. Girls and boys learn how to engage together in the classroom, and they learn about their own abilities at the very early years. So teacher training for primary school teachers is most important, needs to integrate questions of gender. Now, our best ally on this work has been FAWE, who developed very early on gender responsive pedagogy, which has been introduced across the continent in Africa very effectively in teacher training. Now, it has been used differently in each country, so I'm not going to be able to say how it has been used in countries by FAWE or how those have been integrated into the teacher training institutions, but they have a very good experience of working with teacher training institutions to build in gender responsive pedagogical approaches. And I would suggest the readers or the participants on the call go to the website of FAWE to have a look at what material is available. They are actually going through a process of renewal right now and looking at gender responsive pedagogy, which they recommend to teachers in order to make sure it's current and actually picks up what's going on in 2016 because it was developed quite early. Now, I don't think I'm familiar with any country which has been able to systematically integrate gender considerations across their teaching training institutions. And in fact, I think that thanks. I've just been given a suggestion that you're also going to look to the Good Practice Fund case study on FAWE, which will give you a highlight of their work. But just to say that I don't know of a case study which shows how any country has taken the teacher training institutions and systematically integrated gender equality as a core theme across all their work. Although, of course, a lot of countries have taken this idea and introduced at least one module in a larger piece of work. However, it remains to be a significant challenge. Some of the work that Elaine Unterhalter has been doing in Nigeria seeks to highlight the serious challenge of, even when teacher training institutions have integrated questions of gender, the teachers don't have the opportunity to use those skills in their classroom because of a number of features. So I think the questioner has put their finger on a really critically important area of research and planning and policy work. So bravo, and let's see whether that individual can help us build on that, build that knowledge.
Okay, I remember that USAID is actually developing or has developed a kind of toolkit in order to do the gender mainstreaming of the textbooks. It's not actually about the
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right, and that will be launched next week. And I think that's a very important. There's another webinar which we're all keen to see, participate in, and to find the guidance. That is because we know that textbooks, when they're available, are critically important to what goes on in the classroom. We do know of another NGO actor, CAMFED, who works in Africa, and their model of teacher training is to supplement the teacher with a learning guide who's a young graduate of secondary school, who is a graduate also with of CAMFED's experience, CAMFED's training. So they are in the classroom to reinforce and to support teachers and to make sure that questions of gender are recognized and they can follow up with the students after the session. So this is a different model, which is not actually reaching teachers directly, but reinforcing the teaching in the classroom in a really, it's demonstrated to be a very effective way. And girls and boys are learning better, particularly girls, through this process.
All right. We also did the gender mainstreaming of the text, the learning materials at the IIP.
Very good.
All right, next question. To be connected to the previous question, especially at early childhood education level, are there any promising gender equality interventions targeting at this special group?
That's a question I don't think I have an answer for, except to highlight two things. Very interesting. Of course, it is a critically important time of life because you learn what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl very early. And so you understand, for example, whether or not bashing someone over the head is your right or not. And particularly if, when people talk about, they're just boys being boys, that's fine. That boys can be aggressive and to demonstrate their disagreement about something. However, we also know that not very many, compared to primary school, far fewer students get into early childhood, and that it tends to be the more wealthy students around the world who have access to early childhood programs. And then in fact, we have gender parity. To a large extent, the same numbers of boys and girls get into early childhood. So that's an interesting observation. We also know that the teaching staff is predominantly female, which introduces another challenge for us, because boys also learn how to be a boy by being surrounded by mentors and role models who are male. So in fact, in Latin America and the Caribbean, there has been work trying to understand how to diversify the teaching staff in early childhood, given the fact that the significant feminization of the teaching staff in the early years is problematic for boys in the Caribbean. So that whole area, there has been some work in this area, but far less than we would like to see. I have a feeling that no one has looked at early childhood material, programming, images of the very early years. I doubt very much there has been a gender review of that material, but I'd be delighted to hear if someone knows of an example. They should please contact me through Miyoko so that we can actually bring that to the fore. The GEM report for this year worked with a university in the United States, and I can't remember which one, I'm afraid, to do a review of textbooks, which would supplement the work that USAID is going to be presenting, to look at the images which are integrated into textbooks, which tell the reader, the student, what expectations they might have for their future as boys or as girls, as grown-up adults. Now, I don't know, in fact, whether or not that included early childhood reading materials. That would be a good question. I would guess we should probably be looking at the website of the GEM because they have launched all of the research papers that were done which were background for the GEM report, and I'm pretty sure that that research would be documented there. That would be a place we could go to see if there has been a review of early childhood material from a gender perspective.
Okay, so that could be a niche for all the researchers who want to do this.
Absolutely.
Yes. Next question. In countries where educational policies are largely gender blind, how do you suggest them to start the process of monitoring and evaluating gender equality from scratch? What is the biggest barrier?
Oh boy, that's a challenge. Let me say that the countries which have not, I know I say that a lot, the countries which are least likely to have worked on gender issues are those which are struggling struggling broadly to do sector planning, and who are struggling with conflict and fragility in their country. Countries such as Central African Republic and others where there is an ongoing crisis which must be managed. They have little time to attend to issues of gender, and they have, they may have serious issues of getting girls into school because schools are closed for crisis issues or because there's ongoing conflict. Those are the countries where where it's most unlikely that they would have had an opportunity to look at the gender mainstreaming issues, gender responsiveness of their plan. Now, nonetheless, they will be collecting data. They will be starting to understand who is going to school and who's not. So having gender disaggregated data is so important because it at least starts to help the policymakers and the planners to understand where the disparities are. So collecting disaggregated data, that's where we would want to go. Disaggregation by sex, by location, as much disaggregation as possible, because it's only built on that you can target appropriately, where you know where in the country girls are being excluded or boys are being pulled out for whatever reason. So I would say that is the absolute first place to go. But then soon after that, being able to reach out to the gender advocates in the country to understand what the gender issues are. Is it early marriage? Is it early pregnancy? Is it the fact that curriculum and the classroom is irrelevant to boys who are needing to be picking up work for financial purposes, or because the actual program has so little to do, provides them with so little skills, practical skills, that they are not staying in school. So reaching out to those who are in the country who are doing work in this area. It would be civil society, it might be universities, it might be a Ministry of Gender, who would be starting to understand and unpacking what are the gender barriers which are prevalent in the country, because that knowledge will be there somewhere. Someone will know that. So listening to those voices and therefore having that background to influence their planners. Often, what happens is that even if there is a gender unit, they will be siloed in a ministry which is struggling to get its plan together. And that the planners will not be recognizing that they have an expert down the hall who might help them to integrate gender questions into their work. The other reality is that gender equality is not common to those who use hardcore economic analysis. They may not be familiar with that approach, and they in fact may not recognize the importance of looking at questions of gender. So in some ways, there is a requirement of an attitude change in some environments where they begin to understand that it is relevant, it is informative, and it is the right of all children to go to school, both your girls and boys, and so that the plans must be informed by that knowledge.
So let's say that you are required to organize a kind of a workshop in such a country. what would be your approach to the capacity building? You put together planners and gender specialists and economists together and talk about the same thing, or do you have some other approaches?
That approach is what we would recommend, so that the economists can start to understand what the gender issues are, the planners, and the gender experts can start to understand what is sector planning, because that is a significant challenge where the gender expertise does not understand the approach which the planners take. And if the planners don't understand the gender considerations and how to integrate that, the two need to start to better understand each other's work. The expertise of planning and the process of planning is fairly technical, but it has to become more the language of the gender experts in the ministry in order for the plans to be informed, and in order for, during the annual review, gender expertise to be seen as relevant, because the gender experts understand the approach which is taken by the planners. So at the workshop level, at the country level, bringing people together and allowing them to interrogate the data and the policies and the plans together to understand where there may be gaps, what information needs to be additional to what's currently existing, or just to understand the data to better, so that it can be used to identify strategies to address the places where there are girls or boys being excluded.
Okay, yeah. Now, another question just came in. You have mentioned indicators, as gender equality is closely connected with the underlying group's capabilities. Would you say qualitative data collection is more important in the M&E process, or vice versa?
That's a question which asks for an answer which I think is always needs to be framed in the context, of course, but I think there's not a hierarchy between types of analysis. Qualitative and quantitative data is equally important. The challenge for us in depending entirely on qualitative data is that we need to have the tools which will give us the kind of information we need in a quantitative. If we depend entirely on quantitative data, we need to have indicators which are sound and which give us the type of information which will allow us to understand gender equality. Whereas to a large extent, the quantitative indices which we have now, or indicators, give us parity data. So that's why we also need qualitative data, which will help us to understand what's really going on. Let me give you an example, because that's a very abstract response. Plan International has been managing a long-term research initiative. Started in 2005. It is monitoring the experience of a number of girls as they grow up from birth through to 18 years. It's a longitudinal study. And right now, it was launched on the International Day of the Girl. It's called Real Lives, Real Choices. And it's a longitudinal study looking at girls' education. Girls broadly, but their education as well. And so it takes a gender lens to the research. Through this process, we are starting to understand the reality of the work, of the use of time by girls. And they are starting to comment on how much time they spend looking after their family, collecting water or wood or doing home care of some kind. And we're starting to understand the granularity of that data, what it actually takes, what work they are doing instead of doing their homework, as opposed to what work the boys are doing, or we know it's considerably less. And we know some of the poorest rural girls are not learning as well as the poorest rural boys, because the girls are responsible for so much more homework, not schoolwork at home, but domestic work. And we are understanding the reality of that through the longitudinal study which Plan has provided. At the same time, UNICEF launched for the first time hard data on the number of hours that girls do domestic work, and that was also launched on the International Day of the Girl. So that is quantitative data about home about the experience of girls, but in particular, I'm referencing to the domestic work that girls do. But that is amazing and astronomical in terms of our now understanding the number of hours and the percentage of their time which is spent on that. It's an education issue for us, given the fact that when they're not doing studies, when they are doing domestic work, they're not studying, and sometimes they come to school tired and hungry because they've been doing this other stuff. But now with the qualitative material provided by Plan, the two together give us a clear understanding of what is the reality of girls' lives and how does the education sector respond to that and compensate?
Yeah, it's important to be able to monitor the progress, and therefore the indicators. When we say indicators, that needs to be comparable throughout time, which is very tricky in the qualitative data collection. But whatever the indicators we are talking about, I think behind the construction of the indicators, there's a lot of work in terms of the construction of the tools, and then that's what you're talking about. Now,
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, the time is up. Now,
I'm sorry, because it's been a really interesting conversation, and I thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to thank Nora one more time for giving us, very wide insights about gender equality in education and beyond education. So we look forward to our continuous collaboration within the course and then also after the course. All right. So
thank you, Miyoko.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.